You were never really his wife, Nancy. This house, everything in it, it all belongs to us now. Those words hit me like a physical blow as I stood in my own kitchen, still wearing the black dress from Robert's funeral just 3 days earlier. My stepson Michael's cold eyes showed no trace of the little boy I'd tucked into bed for 15 years, no memory of the woman who'd bandaged his scraped knees and cheered at his baseball games. The smell of the casseroles neighbors had brought still lingered in the air, mixed with the fading scent of the lilies from Robert's service. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway, the one Robert and I had bought for our 10th anniversary, ticking away the seconds of what I thought was my life, my home, my world. But apparently, I was wrong about everything. It started that Tuesday morning when I was still in my bathrobe, sorting through Robert's papers in his study. The mahogany desk where he'd paid bills for 25 years was covered with documents I needed to organize: insurance policies, bank statements, the deed to our house. I was moving slowly, still numb from grief, when the doorbell rang with an urgency that made my heart skip. Through the frosted glass, I could see 2 figures. When I opened the door, there stood Michael and Sarah, Robert's children from his first marriage to Elizabeth. I hadn't seen them in over 3 years. Not since that terrible Christmas when Sarah had accused me of trying to replace their mother and stormed out. Robert had been heartbroken by their absence, but they'd made it clear they wanted nothing to do with our life together. "We need to talk," Michael said, pushing past me into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. He was 42 now, with Robert's same stubborn jawline but none of his warmth. Sarah followed, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floors I'd refinished myself just last spring. "Of course," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know this is hard for all of us. Your father loved you both so much, and I thought maybe now we could." "Cut the act, Nancy," Sarah interrupted, her voice sharp as broken glass. "We're not here for a family reunion." She pulled a manila envelope from her oversized purse, the kind of envelope that holds important documents. Legal documents. My hands were shaking as I led them to the living room, past the family photos that lined the hallway. Pictures of Robert and me at Niagara Falls for our honeymoon, at Sarah's high school graduation where I'd cheered louder than anyone, at Michael's wedding where I'd helped Elizabeth, their mother, choose flowers before she got too sick to care about such things. "Sit down," Michael commanded, and something in his tone made me obey without question. The leather armchair where Robert used to read his evening paper suddenly felt foreign beneath me, as if I was a guest in my own home. Sarah opened the envelope with deliberate slowness, like a magician building suspense before the final, devastating trick. "This is Dad's will," she announced, holding up a document I'd never seen before. His real will, dated 6 months ago. The paper rustled as she unfolded it, and I caught a glimpse of Robert's signature at the bottom, that familiar scrawl I'd seen on birthday cards and love notes for a quarter of a century. But the words she read aloud made no sense, as if she was speaking a foreign language. "To my children, Michael Robert Harrison and Sarah Elizabeth Harrison, I leave my entire estate, including the family home at 1247 Maple Street, all bank accounts, investments, and personal property." Her voice droned on, but I couldn't process the meaning. This had to be a mistake, some old document from before our marriage. "I don't understand," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant. "Robert and I made wills together just 2 years ago. Everything was supposed to be mine, and then to you both after I couldn't finish the sentence. The idea of my own death had seemed so far away when we'd sat in that lawyer's office, holding hands and planning for a future that would never come. Michael leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and for a moment I saw a flicker of something that might have been pity. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "That's the thing, Nancy. You see, there's a problem with your marriage to our father." The room seemed to tilt slightly, as if the foundation of the house, of my entire world, had shifted beneath me. "What do you mean?" Sarah's smile was cold and triumphant. "We had our lawyer do some digging. Turns out Dad never actually divorced our mother. Not legally. Which means your marriage to him was never valid." The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. I gripped the arms of the chair, my knuckles white against the brown leather. That's impossible. I was at their divorce hearing. I remember Elizabeth crying and Robert holding my hand in the courthouse hallway afterward. We got married 6 months later. Papers can be filed incorrectly, Michael said with a shrug, as if he was discussing the weather instead of destroying my entire life. Bureaucratic errors happen all the time. The point is, legally speaking, you were never his wife. You were just living together. The grandfather clock chimed 11 times, each note echoing through the sudden silence. I thought about all those years, Christmas mornings, anniversary dinners, the night Robert had his heart attack and I'd ridden in the ambulance, holding his hand and whispering promises that everything would be okay. Had none of it mattered? Had I been living a lie for 25 years? Even if that were true, I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice, Robert would never have left me with nothing. He loved me. Love doesn't change the law, Sarah replied, folding the will and sliding it back into the envelope. This house belongs to us now. Dad's bank accounts, his pension, his life insurance, all of it goes to his legal heirs. His children. I looked around the living room, at the throw pillows I'd sewn by hand, the bookshelf filled with novels Robert and I had shared, the piano where I'd taught both Michael and Sarah to play chopsticks when they were small. Every corner held a memory. Every surface bore the imprint of our life together. You can't be serious, I whispered. We've already spoken to our lawyer, Michael said, standing up and straightening his tie. You have 30 days to vacate the premises. We're being generous, legally. We could have you out by the end of the week. The word generous hung in the air like smoke, bitter and choking. I thought about the teenage boy who'd sobbed in my arms when his girlfriend broke up with him, the young man I'd helped move into his first apartment, the son I'd gained when I married his father. Where was that person now? What about Robert's things? I asked, my voice barely audible. His clothes, his books, the watch his father gave him? Everything stays with the house, Sarah said firmly. It's all part of the estate. I felt something crack inside my chest, like ice breaking on a frozen pond. Even my things? My grandmother's china, my mother's jewelry? If you can prove you own them before the marriage, you can take them, Michael replied. But anything purchased during your relationship with Dad belongs to the estate. 25 years of my life, reduced to a relationship. I thought about the engagement ring still on my finger, the wedding dress hanging in the back of our closet, the photo albums filled with pictures of a family that apparently never existed. I need to call my lawyer, I said, more to myself than to them. Sarah laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Go ahead. But I'd start looking for somewhere else to live if I were you. Maybe one of those senior communities has an opening. They left me sitting in that chair, surrounded by the remnants of what I'd thought was my life. The front door closed with a soft click, and I was alone with the ticking of the grandfather clock and the sound of my own heartbeat, loud and irregular in the sudden silence. I sat there for what felt like hours, watching the dust motes dance in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the windows Robert and I had chosen together. Everything looked the same, but nothing would ever be the same again. That night, I couldn't sleep in the bed I'd shared with Robert for 25 years. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that grew cold in my hands, staring at the phone and trying to find the courage to call someone, anyone, who might help me make sense of this nightmare. But who could I call? My sister lived in Florida and barely knew the details of my marriage. My closest friends were other wives from the neighborhood. And how could I explain that I might never have been a wife at all? The shame of it burned in my chest like acid. As dawn broke over the maple tree in our backyard, the tree Robert had planted for our 5th anniversary, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let them take everything without a fight. There had to be an explanation, some mistake that could be corrected. Robert had loved me. I knew that as surely as I knew my own name. And love like that doesn't just disappear because of paperwork. I had 30 days to prove that my marriage, my life, my love had been real. 30 days to fight for everything I'd ever held dear. I just didn't know yet how much I'd have to lose before I could win it back. The next morning, I woke up on the living room couch with a crick in my neck and the taste of despair in my mouth. For a brief, Merciful moment. I thought it had all been a nightmare. Then I saw the manila envelope Sarah had left on the coffee table, and reality crashed over me like a cold wave. I made myself a pot of coffee, the same brand Robert and I had shared every morning for 25 years, and tried to think clearly. If there had been some mistake with the divorce papers, there would be records. Courts keep everything, don't they? I'd start there. The Riverside County Courthouse was a 40-minute drive from our house, and I'd only been there twice before, once for Robert's divorce proceedings in 1998 and once for our marriage license. The building looked smaller than I remembered, its gray stone facade weathered by decades of California sun. Inside, the clerk's office smelled like old paper and industrial disinfectant. A young woman with purple streaks in her hair looked up from her computer screen as I approached the counter. "I need to see divorce records," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "From 1998. Harrison versus Harrison." She typed something into her computer, her long nails clicking against the keys. "I'm showing a Robert James Harrison and Elizabeth Marie Harrison. Is that what you're looking for?" "Yes," I said, my heart pounding. "I need copies of the final decree." More typing than a frown. "That's strange. I'm showing the case was filed, but there's no final decree on record. It looks like the case was dismissed." The floor seemed to shift beneath my feet. Dismissed? What does that mean? Usually means the parties reconciled or decided not to proceed with the divorce. She looked at me with something that might have been sympathy. "Are you family?" "I'm his. I was his." I couldn't finish the sentence. What was I exactly? I was married to him after this divorce was supposed to be finalized. Her eyes widened slightly. "Oh. Oh my. You might want to speak to a lawyer about this." I drove home in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. How is it possible that Robert had never divorced Elizabeth? I remembered that day so clearly. Elizabeth in her navy blue suit, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, Robert's hand warm and reassuring in mine as we waited in the hallway. But memory, I was learning, could be a treacherous thing. Back home, I went straight to Robert's study. If there were answers to be found, they'd be in here, among his carefully organized files and the lifetime of papers he'd never thrown away. Robert had been meticulous about record-keeping, every tax return, every insurance policy, every receipt for major purchases, all filed away in labeled folders. I started with the filing cabinet, pulling out folder after folder. Insurance, tax returns 2020 to 2024, house maintenance, medical records. My hands were shaking as I searched, and more than once I had to stop and wipe away tears that blurred my vision. Then I found it, a folder labeled legal documents that I'd never paid much attention to before. Inside were copies of wills, power of attorney forms, and there, at the bottom, a manila envelope marked Divorce Papers EMH. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. Inside were the original divorce filing papers from 1998, but as I read through them, my confusion deepened. The documents showed that Robert had indeed filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. Elizabeth had been served with papers, but there was no final decree, no judge's signature making it official. Instead, there was a handwritten note clipped to the back of the file. Case dismissed per joint motion. Parties reconciled November 15th, 98. November 15th, 1998. I remembered that date for an entirely different reason. It was the day Robert had proposed to me. We'd been dating for 8 months, and he'd taken me to the little Italian restaurant where we'd had our first date. Over tiramisu and champagne, he'd gotten down on one knee and asked me to marry him. "I want to start fresh," he'd said that night, slipping the diamond ring onto my finger. "I want to build a new life with you, Nancy. You make me believe in love again." Had he lied to me? Had he called off his divorce the same day he proposed to another woman? The thought made me physically ill. I spent the rest of the day going through every piece of paper in Robert's study, looking for some explanation, some proof that this was all a terrible mistake. But the more I searched, the more questions I found instead of answers. There were bank statements showing regular payments to something called EMH Trust, payments that had continued right up until Robert's death. There were insurance policies I'd never seen before, with Elizabeth listed as the beneficiary. There was even a deed to a small cabin in Lake Tahoe that I'd never known existed, with both Robert's and Elizabeth's names on it. How had I lived with this man for 25 years and known so little about his financial life? I trusted him completely, never questioned the bills he paid or the accounts he managed. I'd been content to let him handle the business side of our marriage while I focused on making our house a home. That trust, I realized now, had been my greatest mistake. As the sun set outside the study window, I found myself staring at our wedding photo on Robert's desk. We looked so happy, so sure of our future together. I was wearing my grandmother's pearl necklace and the dress I'd spent months searching for, and Robert was looking at me like I was the most beautiful woman in the world. Had it all been a lie? Had he known even then that our marriage wasn't legal? Or had he somehow convinced himself that the technicalities didn't matter, that love was enough to make it real? The phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. It was my neighbor, Helen, calling to check on me. "How are you holding up, dear?" she asked, her voice warm with concern. "I saw Michael and Sarah leaving yesterday. I hope they came to offer support." I almost laughed at the irony. "Something like that," I managed to say. "Well, if you need anything at all, you just call. Jim and I are here for you." After I hung up, I realized that Helen and Jim might be the last people to treat me with such kindness once word got out about my situation. How do you explain to your neighbors that your 25-year marriage was apparently a sham? How do you face the pitying looks and whispered conversations? That night, I did something I hadn't done since I was a child. I got down on my knees beside my bed and prayed. Not the formal prayers I recited in church on Sundays, but desperate, rambling pleas for guidance, for strength, for some way to make sense of the wreckage my life had become. "Please," I whispered into the darkness. "Please help me understand. Help me find the truth." The next morning brought no divine revelation, but it did bring determination. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could fight for what was right. Robert had loved me. I knew that in my bones, in the deepest part of my soul. Whatever legal technicalities existed, whatever mistakes had been made, our love had been real. And if our love was real, then there had to be a way to prove it. I made a list of everyone who had known Robert and me as a couple, everyone who could testify to the reality of our marriage. Our pastor, who had performed the ceremony. Our friends, who had celebrated anniversaries with us. The neighbors who had watched us build a life together. I also made a list of questions that needed answers. Why had Robert's divorce been dismissed? What was the EMH trust, and why had he been paying into it? How had Michael and Sarah known about these legal issues when I didn't? But first, I needed a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. I needed someone who specialized in estate law, someone who could navigate the complex web of legal issues surrounding my marriage and Robert's will. I found David Collins' name in the phone book, in an advertisement that promised compassionate legal representation for families in crisis. His office was in a modest building downtown, nothing fancy or intimidating. When I called, his secretary was able to fit me in that afternoon. David Collins was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a gentle manner that put me at ease immediately. His office was cluttered with law books and family photos, and he offered me tea while I told him my story. "This is quite complex," he said when I finished, leaning back in his chair and studying the documents I'd brought. "But not impossible to resolve. The first thing we need to do is get a complete copy of the divorce file from 1998. If the case was dismissed because the parties reconciled, there should be documentation explaining why. What if Robert really never divorced Elizabeth?" I asked, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "Then we'll deal with that," he said simply. "But Nancy, I want you to understand something. Even if your marriage wasn't technically legal, you still have rights. You lived as husband and wife for 25 years. You contributed to the household. You cared for him in sickness and health. California has laws protecting people in situations like yours." For the first time in days, I felt a small spark of hope. "So, I won't lose everything?" "Not if I can help it," he said, and something in his voice made me believe him. As I drove home from David's office, I felt stronger than I had since this nightmare began. I had an ally now, someone who understood the law and was willing to fight for me. But more than that, I had something Michael and Sarah didn't expect, the absolute certainty that Robert had loved me, and that love, even if it couldn't change the past, might be enough to secure my future. I just had no idea how much more I'd have to endure before the truth finally came to light. 3 weeks into my 30-day deadline, David called with news that made my blood run cold. "Nancy, I need you to come to my office immediately," he said, his voice tight with an emotion I couldn't identify. "I've found something, and we need to discuss it in person." The drive to his office felt like the longest 20 minutes of my life. My mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Had he discovered that Robert really had been married to 2 women? Had he found proof that I had no legal claim to anything? David's secretary ushered me into his office without the usual pleasantries. He was standing by the window, his back to me, holding a thick manila folder. "Sit down, Nancy," he said without turning around. "What I'm about to tell you is going to be difficult to hear." I perched on the edge of the chair, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my wedding ring cut into my skin. "Just tell me. I can handle it." He turned around then, and I saw something in his eyes that made my stomach drop. It wasn't pity or sympathy, it was anger.
Pure, Raiti Assanger.
"Your stepchildren have been lying to you," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "About everything." The words didn't make sense at first. "What do you mean?" David opened the folder and pulled out a document. "This is the real divorce decree between Robert and Elizabeth Harrison, dated December 15th, 1998. It was finalized exactly 1 month before your wedding. Your marriage to Robert was completely legal." I stared at the paper he handed me, at the official seal and the judge's signature that made it real. But the clerk at the courthouse said. The clerk was looking at falsified records. David interrupted. "Someone went to considerable trouble to alter the court database, making it appear that the divorce was never finalized. But the original paper records tell a different story." My head was spinning. How is that possible? Who would do such a thing? David's jaw tightened. Someone with access to the court's computer system. Someone who knew exactly what they were looking for and how to change it. This wasn't a random error, Nancy. This was deliberate fraud. The room seemed to tilt around me. "You're saying Michael and Sarah?" "I'm saying someone paid to have those records altered. And given who benefits from this deception, it's not hard to guess who." He pulled out another document. "There's more. That will they showed you? The one supposedly written 6 months ago?" Robert's signature was forged. I felt like I was drowning, gasping for air in a world that had suddenly turned upside down. "How do you know?" "I had a handwriting expert examine it. The signature is close, but not perfect. Whoever did it had access to examples of Robert's handwriting, but they couldn't replicate the subtle pressure variations and pen lifts that make each person's signature unique." David sat down across from me, his expression gentler now. "Nancy, your husband never wrote a new will. The will you and Robert made together 2 years ago is still valid. This house, his accounts, everything, it all belongs to you, just as you thought." I should have felt relief, joy, vindication. Instead, I felt a rage so pure and hot it scared me. "They knew," I whispered. "They knew our marriage was legal, and they tried to steal everything anyway." "It gets worse," David said quietly. "I did some digging into their finances. Michael owes over $200,000 in gambling debts to some very unpleasant people. Sarah's boutique business is failing, and she's facing bankruptcy. They weren't just greedy, Nancy. They were desperate." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. The 3 years of silence, the sudden appearance at Robert's funeral, the cold efficiency with which they delivered their devastating news. It had all been planned, calculated, rehearsed. "How long have they been planning this?" I asked. "Based on what I've found, probably since Robert's first heart attack 2 years ago. They knew he wasn't going to live forever, and they started laying the groundwork then." I thought about that heart attack, how frightened I'd been, how Robert had gripped my hand in the hospital and made me promise to take care of myself if anything happened to him. Had his own children been planning to rob me even then, while I was terrified of losing the man I loved. There's something else, David continued. That EMH trust you found records of? It's not what you think. Robert set it up as a memorial fund in Elizabeth's name to help families dealing with cancer. He'd been contributing to it since her death 10 years ago. It was his way of honoring her memory and dealing with his guilt over their divorce. Even in my anger, I felt a stab of love for Robert.
Of course he would have done something like that.
He'd always carried guilt about the end of his first marriage, even though Elizabeth's illness had driven them apart long before her death. So, what do we do now? I asked. David's smile was sharp as a blade. Now we fight back. But Nancy, I need you to understand something. When we expose this fraud, it's going to get ugly. Michael and Sarah are going to claim they were acting in good faith, that they believed the documents were real. They'll try to paint you as a gold digger who manipulated their father.
Are you prepared for that?
I thought about the little boy who used to crawl into my lap when he had nightmares, the teenage girl I'd helped through her first heartbreak. Those children were gone, replaced by strangers who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to their inheritance. I'm prepared, I said and meant it.
Good.
Because I have a plan, but it's going to require you to be stronger than you've ever been. David outlined his strategy. We would gather evidence quietly, building an airtight case before confronting Michael and Sarah. We would document the forged will, the altered court records, and their financial desperation. And then, when we had everything we needed, we would spring the trap. I want you to act as if nothing has changed, David instructed. Don't let them know you suspect anything. In fact, I want you to seem defeated, maybe even grateful for their generosity in giving you 30 days.
Can you do that?
The thought of pretending gratitude to the people who had tried to destroy me made my skin crawl, but I nodded. What about the house? My 30 days are almost up. Let them think they've won. Move out if you have to. We'll find you a temporary place. But document everything you take, everything you leave behind. When this is over, you'll want an accurate inventory. That night, I sat in Robert's study one last time, surrounded by the life we'd built together. Tomorrow, I would start packing, playing the role of the defeated widow who had accepted her fate. But inside, I was planning my own kind of justice. I pulled out a piece of Robert's stationery and began writing letters to our pastor, to our friends, to everyone who had known us as a couple. I told them what was happening, what Michael and Sarah had done, and asked them to be ready to testify to the truth of our marriage when the time came. As I wrote, I thought about the children I had loved as my own, the family I had tried so hard to build and keep together. They had thrown that love back in my face, had tried to erase not just my legal rights but my very existence in Robert's life. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated me. I wasn't just Robert's widow, grieving and vulnerable. I was Nancy Harrison, a woman who had survived 62 years of life's challenges, who had built a career as a high school English teacher, who had helped raise 2 children who weren't biologically mine and loved them anyway. And I was about to show Michael and Sarah exactly what kind of woman they had chosen to cross. The next morning, I called Sarah and asked if we could meet for coffee. I made my voice small and defeated, the voice of a woman who had accepted her fate. I've been thinking about what you said, I told her when she answered. About finding a senior community. I think you're right. It's time for me to start over. I could hear the satisfaction in her voice as she agreed to meet me at the little cafe downtown where Robert and I used to have breakfast on Sundays. She had no idea she was walking into a trap that had been 25 years in the making. Because while Michael and Sarah had been planning to steal my past, I had been living it. And the truth I was about to discover was far more powerful than any lie they could tell. The cafe smelled like cinnamon and fresh coffee, the same comforting aromas that had welcomed Robert and me every Sunday morning for 15 years. But sitting across from Sarah, watching her stir sugar into her latte with barely concealed smugness, those familiar scents felt like a mockery of everything I'd lost. I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this, Nancy, Sarah said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. I know this transition must be difficult for you. I kept my hands wrapped around my coffee cup to hide their trembling, not from fear, but from the effort it took to contain my rage. It is difficult, I said, making my voice small and broken. 25 years is a long time to build a life with someone. Well, you'll always have the memories, she replied, and I caught the slight smirk she tried to hide behind her cup. That's what really matters, isn't it? Memories. As if memories could pay for groceries or keep a roof over my head. As if memories were all I deserved after a quarter-century of love and devotion. I've been looking at some senior communities, I continued, playing my part perfectly. There's a nice one about an hour north of here. Very affordable. That sounds perfect, Sarah said, her relief evident. And Nancy, I want you to know that Michael and I were not heartless. We know Dad cared about you. So we've decided to give you a little something to help with the transition. She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. There's $5,000 in here. It should help you get settled in your new place. $5,000. After 25 years of marriage, after helping to raise their children, after caring for their father through illness and loving him until his last breath, they thought my life was worth $5,000. I took the envelope with shaking hands, and for a moment, my mask almost slipped. Sarah must have seen something in my eyes because her expression shifted slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. That's very generous, I managed to say. Thank you. Of course, she said, but she was studying me more carefully now. We want to do right by you, Nancy. Dad would have wanted that. The mention of Robert nearly broke my composure entirely. How dare she invoke his name while stealing everything he'd worked for, everything he'd wanted me to have? When do you need me out of the house? I asked. Well, we were thinking this weekend would be good. Michael has already arranged for a moving company to come Monday morning to start clearing things out. This weekend.
3 days away.
They weren't just stealing from me. They were rushing to cover their tracks, to get me out of the picture before I could cause any problems. I understand, I said. I'll be ready. After Sarah left, I sat in that cafe for another hour, watching the normal world go by outside the window. Couples holding hands, families with children, people living their ordinary lives without knowing that just a few feet away, a woman was planning to bring down the two people who had tried to destroy her. That afternoon, I met with David at his office to finalize our strategy. How did it go? He asked as soon as I walked in. They're moving fast. I told him about the $5,000, the weekend deadline the moving company scheduled for Monday. They want me gone before I can cause trouble. David nodded grimly. That actually works in our favor. The faster they move, the more mistakes they'll make. And Nancy, I have some good news. I've been in touch with the district attorney's office. When we're ready to move, they'll be very interested in prosecuting this case. Criminal charges? Fraud, forgery, computer crimes, this isn't just a civil matter anymore. What they did was serious criminal activity. The thought of Michael and Sarah in handcuffs should have given me satisfaction, but instead, I felt only a deep sadness. These were children I had loved, had helped raise, had considered my own. How had it come to this? There's something else, David continued. I've been doing more research into their finances. Michael's gambling debts are worse than we thought. He owes money to some very dangerous people, and they've been pressuring him for payment. Sarah's business isn't just failing, she's been embezzling from her investors to keep it afloat. So this really was desperation, I said. Desperation that led them to commit serious crimes, David replied firmly. Nancy, I need you to remember that. What they did to you wasn't just wrong, it was evil. They were willing to destroy you to save themselves. That evening, I began the hardest performance of my life. I called Michael and told him about my meeting with Sarah, about the senior community I was supposedly considering, about how grateful I was for their generosity. I know this has been hard for all of us, I said, injecting just the right amount of tremor into my voice. But I think your father would be proud of how we're handling this. Like a family. Yeah, Michael said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. Dad always said you were a class act, Nancy. I'm glad we can work this out without any complications. Complications. That's what I was to them now, a potential complication in their theft of my life. Over the next 2 days, I played the part of the grateful, defeated widow to perfection. I packed my clothes and personal items, leaving behind everything that had made the house a home. I thanked neighbors for their kindness and told them I was starting a new chapter in a senior community. I even went to the bank and closed the small checking account that was in my name only, making sure to mention to the teller that I was moving away. All the while, David was working behind the scenes, gathering evidence, building our case, preparing for the moment when we would reveal the truth. The hardest part was packing Robert's things. Michael and Sarah had given me permission to take a few sentimental items: his wedding ring, a photo from our honeymoon, one of his favorite books. As if a lifetime of love could be reduced to a few trinkets. But as I went through his belongings, I found something that made my heart race. Hidden in the back of his sock drawer was a small metal box I'd never seen before. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to me, all in Robert's handwriting. My hands shook as I opened the first one, dated just 6 months before his death. My dearest Nancy, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably going through my things. I hope you never have to read these letters, but if something happens to me, I want you to know how much you've meant to me. You saved my life when I thought it was over. You gave me love when I thought I was too broken to deserve it. You are my wife in every way that matters, and I pray that my children will remember that and treat you with the love and respect you deserve. I sank onto the bed, tears streaming down my face as I read letter after letter. Robert had known. Somehow, he had sensed that there might be trouble after his death, and he had tried to protect me the only way he knew how, with words of love and truth. The last letter was different from the others. Nancy, if Michael and Sarah are causing you problems, look in my study. Behind the bookshelf, there's a loose board in the wall. I've left something there that might help you. I love you more than life itself. Don't let anyone tell you our marriage wasn't real. It was the most real thing I ever experienced. With trembling hands, I went to Robert's study and found the loose board he'd mentioned. Behind it was another small box, and inside that box was a USB drive labeled for Nancy's protection. I plugged the drive into Robert's computer, and what I found there made me gasp. Robert had been keeping records, detailed financial records, copies of legal documents, even recordings of phone conversations with Michael and Sarah from the past 2 years. In one recording, made just 3 months before Robert's death, I heard Sarah's voice clearly. "Dad, you need to think about changing your will. Nancy's not really family. When you're gone, she'll just be some woman living in our family home." And Michael's voice. "We've been patient long enough. That house should come to us, not to her." Robert's response was firm. "Nancy is my wife and my family. Everything I have will go to her, just as we planned. I won't hear another word about this." But they hadn't given up. The recordings showed months of pressure, manipulation, and increasingly desperate attempts to convince Robert to disinherit me. When that failed, they had apparently decided to take matters into their own hands. I copied everything onto a separate drive and called David immediately. "This changes everything," he said after I'd explained what I'd found. "With these recordings, we don't just have evidence of fraud, we have evidence of conspiracy and premeditation. Nancy, your husband was trying to protect you even after death." That night, my last night in the house I'd called home for 25 years, I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat in the living room, surrounded by boxes and memories, and planned my final moves in this chess game that Michael and Sarah thought they'd already won. Tomorrow, I would leave this house as they expected. I would play the part of the defeated widow one last time. But I wouldn't be running away. I would be positioning myself for the final strike. Because while they had been planning to steal my past, I had been gathering the weapons to reclaim my future. And when the truth finally came out, it would destroy them as completely as they had tried to destroy me. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of California weather that makes everything look washed out and sad. I stood at the window of the small apartment David had helped me rent, watching the moving trucks pull up to what had been my home for 25 years. From this distance, I could see Michael directing the movers, pointing at furniture and boxes like a general commanding his troops. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Everything is in place. Are you ready? I typed back. Ready. At exactly 10 o'clock, as planned, I drove back to the house. Michael and Sarah were both there, supervising the systematic dismantling of my life. Sarah was wearing designer jeans and a cashmere sweater, looking like she was directing a photo shoot rather than stealing a widow's belongings. Nancy, she called out when she saw me, her voice bright with false cheer. I thought you'd already left for your new place. I forgot a few things, I said, my voice deliberately small and uncertain. I hope that's okay? Of course, Michael said, barely looking up from the clipboard he was holding. Just make it quick. The movers need to finish today. I walked through the house one last time, past the movers carrying out the dining room set where Robert and I had hosted countless family dinners, past the living room where we'd watched movies and shared quiet evenings. Everything that had made this place a home was being loaded into trucks, destined for storage or sale. It's hard to see it all go, I said to Sarah, who was standing in the kitchen directing the packing of dishes. I know, she replied, not sounding like she knew anything at all. But you'll be so much happier in your new place. No maintenance, no yard work, people your own age to socialize with. People my own age. As if I was some doddering old woman who needed to be put away with others like me. Actually, I said, there's something I need to tell you both. Could we sit down for a minute? Michael checked his watch impatiently. Can it wait? We're on a tight schedule here. It's about your father, I said, and that got their attention. I found some things of his that I think you should see. We gathered in the living room, now empty except for a few chairs the movers hadn't taken yet. I pulled out a manila envelope, not unlike the one Sarah had used to deliver her devastating news weeks ago. I was going through Robert's papers, I began, and I found these letters he wrote to me. But there are also some things in here about you both. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. What kind of things? I pulled out one of Robert's letters and began to read. I'm worried about Michael's gambling problem. He called again asking for money, and when I refused, he became angry. He said things about Nancy that I won't repeat, but it's clear he resents her place in my life. Michael's face flushed red. Dad wrote that. There's more, I continued, pulling out another letter. Sarah came by today asking about my will again. She seems to think that Nancy has no right to inherit anything because she's not real family. I'm beginning to think my children see me only as a source of money. That's not true, Sarah protested, but her voice lacked conviction. I know it must be hard to hear, I said gently, but your father was very concerned about both of you in his final months. He loved you, but he was disappointed in the choices you were making. I could see them exchanging glances, trying to figure out where this was going. They thought I was just a grieving widow sharing painful truths, not realizing I was setting a trap. There's something else, I said, pulling out the USB drive. Your father left this for me. He said it contained important information about his finances. I walked over to Robert's laptop, which the movers hadn't taken yet, and plugged in the drive. I thought you might want to see what's on here, since you're handling his estate now. The first file that opened was a video Robert had recorded just 2 months before his death. His face filled the screen, gaunt from illness, but his eyes still sharp and determined. If you're watching this, Nancy, then I'm gone, and you're probably dealing with problems for my children. I want you to know that everything I'm leaving you is yours by right, by law, and by love. Our marriage was real and legal, and anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. Michael and Sarah were staring at the screen in shock, but Robert wasn't finished. I've become aware that Michael and Sarah may try to contest my will or claim that my marriage to Nancy wasn't valid. To prevent this, I've documented everything: our divorce decree, our marriage certificate, all the legal papers that prove Nancy is my lawful wife and heir. The video continued for another 10 minutes, with Robert methodically destroying every argument they had made, every lie they had told. He even mentioned the forged will, saying he'd heard rumors that such documents could be created and wanted to make it clear that his true will was the one filed with his attorney 2 years ago. When the video ended, the room was silent except for the sound of the movers working in other parts of the house. Michael and Sarah sat frozen, their faces pale with shock and growing understanding. There are audio recordings too, I said quietly, clicking on another file. Soon the room filled with their own voices from months past, plotting and scheming, pressuring their dying father to disinherit his wife. Sarah's voice came through the speakers clearly. "She's not really our stepmother, Dad. She's just some woman you married. When you're gone, she'll probably find someone else and forget all about you. And Michael, the house should stay in the family.
Real family.
Nancy can find somewhere else to live." I let the recordings play for several minutes, watching as their faces went from shock to fear to a kind of desperate calculation. They were trying to figure out how to spin this, how to explain away their own words. "I don't understand," Michael finally said, his voice hoarse. "Where did these come from?" "Your father was more aware of what was happening than you realized," I said. "He knew you were planning something, so he took steps to protect me." Sarah stood up abruptly, her composure finally cracking. "This is ridiculous. Even if Dad made these recordings, it doesn't change anything. The legal facts are still the facts." "You're right," I said, standing as well. "The legal facts are the facts. Which is why I think you'll be interested in what my attorney discovered." As if on cue, David walked through the front door, followed by 2 police officers and a man in a suit I didn't recognize. "Nancy," David said formally, "I'd like you to meet Detective Rodriguez and Agent Chen from the district attorney's office." Michael and Sarah were on their feet now, backing away from the group, as if they could somehow escape what was coming. "Michael and Sarah Harrison," Detective Rodriguez said, "you're under arrest for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit theft." "This is insane," Sarah shrieked. "We haven't done anything wrong." Agent Chen stepped forward with a folder full of documents. "We have evidence that you paid someone to alter court records, forged your father's signature on a false will, and attempted to defraud Mrs. Harrison of her rightful inheritance." As the officers read them their rights, I felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. These were the children I had loved, had tried to raise with kindness and patience. But they had chosen greed over love, theft over honor. "Nancy," Michael said as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, "please. We can work this out. We're family." "No," I said quietly. "Family doesn't try to destroy each other. Family doesn't steal from the people who love them. You stopped being my family the moment you decided to erase me from your father's life." As they were led away, Sarah turned back one last time. "You'll never get away with this," she spat. "We'll fight this in court. We'll prove you manipulated Dad, turned him against his own children." "You're welcome to try," I replied. "But the truth has a way of winning in the end." After they were gone, I stood in the empty living room with David and watched the movers loading the last of the furniture into their trucks. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we reverse everything they did," David said. "The house is yours. The bank accounts are yours. Everything your husband left you is yours. It may take a few weeks to sort out all the paperwork, but you'll be back home soon." And they're looking at serious jail time. The evidence is overwhelming, and the district attorney wants to make an example of this case. Elder fraud is a growing problem, and they want to send a message. That evening, I sat in my temporary apartment, surrounded by the few belongings I'd been allowed to take from my own home. But for the first time in weeks, I felt at peace. The truth was out, justice was being served, and soon I would be back where I belonged. 3 months later, I was indeed back home. Michael was sentenced to 5 years in prison for his role in the fraud, while Sarah received 3 years. The house was mine again, along with all of Robert's accounts and possessions. The moving company even returned most of the furniture, though some pieces had been damaged and would need to be replaced. But more importantly, I had reclaimed something that couldn't be measured in dollars or possessions: my dignity, my sense of self-worth, and my faith in justice. I kept Robert's letters in a special box on my nightstand, reading them whenever I felt lonely or sad. His love had protected me even after death, had given me the strength and the tools I needed to fight for what was right. The house felt different now, not because of the missing furniture or the legal battles, but because I had changed. I was no longer the trusting, somewhat naive woman who had let others handle the business side of life. I was stronger now, more aware, more prepared to protect myself and what I'd worked for. I also discovered something unexpected in the aftermath of the trial, a community of people who had been following the case and were inspired by my fight. Other elderly people who had faced similar situations reached out to me, asking for advice and support. I found myself becoming an advocate for elder rights, working with David to help other victims of family fraud. 6 months after that terrible day when Michael and Sarah had tried to destroy my life, I was standing in my kitchen, making coffee and planning my day. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the family photos I'd put back on the walls. Photos of Robert and me, of happier times with Michael and Sarah when they were children, of the life we'd built together. I didn't remove the pictures of them as children. Those memories were real, even if the people they'd become had tried to erase everything we'd shared. Love, I had learned, doesn't disappear just because it's betrayed. It transforms, becomes something different, but no less valuable. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Helen from next door. "Nancy, dear, I'm making too much soup again. Would you like to come over for lunch?" "I'd love to," I said, and meant it. As I hung up the phone, I realized that this was what victory really looked like. Not the courtroom drama or the newspaper headlines about the trial, but this, a quiet morning in my own kitchen, a friend's invitation to lunch, the simple pleasure of being exactly where I belonged. Robert had been right in his letters. Our marriage had been real, our love had been real, and no amount of greed or legal manipulation could change that. I was Nancy Harrison, widow of Robert Harrison, rightful owner of this house and this life, and no one would ever take that away from me again. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times, marking another hour in a life that was fully, completely, and legally mine. And for the first time since Robert's death, I smiled at the sound. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to my story. I know it wasn't easy to hear. It certainly wasn't easy to live through. But I want other people, especially those of us who are older and might be vulnerable to this kind of family fraud, to know that you don't have to accept injustice just because it comes from people you love. You have rights, you have worth, and you deserve to be treated with dignity no matter what your age. If my story resonated with you, please subscribe to hear more real-life experiences from people who've faced challenges and found the strength to overcome them. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever had to fight for what was rightfully yours? How did you find the courage to stand up for yourself? Your stories matter, and sharing them might help someone else who's facing their own battle. Remember, it's never too late to fight for justice, and you're never too old to start over. Sometimes the greatest victories come after the greatest defeats, and sometimes the people who try to break us end up making us stronger than we ever imagined we could be. Until next time, take care of yourselves and remember, you are worth fighting for.